You already know something is wrong with the pattern. Not just this relationship, the pattern. The way the same basic dynamic keeps appearing in different configurations, with different people, in different contexts, that should, by every reasonable analysis, be different enough to produce different results. The colleague whose dismissiveness you absorb with a patience you do not extend to your own mistakes. The friend whose needs consistently take precedence over yours in ways that you accommodate, and then resent, and then accommodate again. The romantic relationship in which the terms somehow always end up distributed in a way that costs you more than it costs the other person, and in which pointing this out produces either a conversation that changes nothing or a guilt that makes you wish you hadn't pointed it out, and in which you eventually stop pointing it out. The family member whose treatment of you would be immediately visible as unacceptable if they were treating someone you loved that way, and which you therefore do not think about in those terms. You have explanations for each instance. The colleague is under pressure. The friend has had it harder. The partner is working on things. The family member is who they are, and you have made your peace with that, more or less, or you have arranged the visits in a way that limits the exposure to a manageable frequency. Each explanation is available, is partially accurate, and is doing work that you have not examined. It is locating the cause of the dynamic in the other person's circumstance, in the relationship's specific history, in the external pressures that make this particular configuration difficult, which means it is not locating the cause in the one variable that appears across every instance of the pattern: you. This is not an accusation. The word deserve is going to come up in this argument, and it is going to be important to understand what it means precisely, because the available misreadings of it produce conclusions that are both incorrect and unkind. You have not been tolerating poor treatment because you deserve poor treatment in any cosmic or moral sense. You have been tolerating it because, at the deepest functional level of how your psychology operates, the conditions being offered match the model. And the model was built a long time ago in circumstances you did not choose, by a logic that was entirely reasonable given what was available to reason with. But the model is still running. And it is the model, not the people, that needs examination. Erich Fromm made a distinction that most psychological accounts of this problem do not reach, and it is the distinction that makes the difference between understanding the pattern as an emotional problem and understanding it as a structural one. He distinguished between what he called the having orientation and the being orientation. But prior to that, and less discussed, he wrote about the way the self relates to its own worth. In the healthy configuration, a person's sense of their own value is what he described as unconditional, not in the sense of being immune to failure or insensitive to the judgments of others, but in the sense of being grounded in something that does not require continuous external validation for its existence. It is simply there. It is the baseline from which the person engages with the world. In the configuration he was most concerned with, the one produced by a specific kind of early relational environment, the sense of worth is not baseline. It is conditional. It has to be earned continuously through performance or compliance or the maintenance of a role that keeps the important people present and available. The self in this configuration has learned that its value is not intrinsic. It is granted and it can be withdrawn. And the behavior that keeps it from being withdrawn is the behavior that becomes organized over time into personality. What this produces is not low self-esteem in the way the term is usually used. It produces something more specific, a self that is genuinely capable of high performance, genuine care, sophisticated understanding of others, and that simultaneously relates to its own needs and its own worth as negotiable in ways that other people's are not. You can advocate effectively for others. You have done it. What you find genuinely difficult, not merely uncomfortable, but structurally difficult in a way that does not respond to instruction, is advocating for yourself with the same force from the same bedrock of certainty that what you need matters. The bedrock is missing, not because you are weak, because the bedrock is established in the first relationship or the first several, and if those relationships established that your value was conditional, the bedrock was built on conditions. And conditional ground moves. The specific place this becomes most visible and most consistently misread is in the experience of being treated well, not the theoretical preference for being treated well which everyone has. The actual felt experience of being in a relationship in which the other person's regard for you is consistent, reliable, and not contingent on your performance of a particular role. This experience, for people with the formation being described, does not produce uncomplicated satisfaction. It produces something more complicated, a quality of unease, of waiting, of not quite being able to accept the terms as real. The unease is not paranoia. It is the model doing what models do, evaluating the incoming information against the established schema and flagging the discrepancy. The schema says, regard is conditional. The incoming experience says, this regard appears unconditional. The model's response, something is wrong. Either the regard is not genuine, or the conditions have not yet been made apparent, or this person does not know enough about you yet to have withdrawn it. Or you will eventually do something that reveals the error in their assessment, and the regard will then be appropriately withdrawn. This is the mechanism that makes good relationships hard to inhabit and difficult relationships feel, in some functional sense, more like home. The difficult relationship is not comfortable, but it is familiar. It confirms the model. It operates within the parameters of what the model was built to navigate. And the self that was organized around navigating conditional regard knows exactly what to do in this territory because it spent its formation learning to do it. The healthy relationship, by contrast, requires the self to operate in conditions it was not trained for, to receive something it was not built to believe it could have consistently, to behave as though its worth is not at stake in every interaction, to stop the continuous management operations that keep the model running. This is not a skill deficit. It is a structural challenge, and it is why people sometimes leave relationships that were genuinely good for ones that confirm what they know. Jung's concept of the complex applies here with a precision that the standard accounts of self-worth tend to miss. The wound, the relational experience that established conditional worth as the operational model, did not simply teach a lesson. It organized a cluster of psychic content. The specific behaviors of the figure who established the conditions, the feelings associated with meeting and failing to meet those conditions, the self-understanding that was assembled in response to the whole experience. This cluster operates as an autonomous organization within the psyche. It has its own logic. It evaluates incoming relational situations according to its own established criteria, and it exerts its influence not through conscious memory, but through the felt quality of situations, through what feels right, what feels familiar, what feels like what relationships are. The person who keeps ending up in relationships where they are undervalued is not choosing these relationships in any straightforward sense. They are being drawn to them by the complex, which recognizes in the relational signature of the difficult person a correspondence to its own established pattern and produces, in response to that recognition, a quality of felt significance that gets interpreted as connection, as chemistry, as the specific electricity that this person uniquely produces. The electricity is real, but what it is signaling is not what it seems to be signaling. It is not signaling that this person is the one who will finally meet your needs. It is signaling that this person's relational signature matches the template of the original conditional relationship closely enough that the complex recognizes it, and recognition, in the domain of attachment, feels like home, even when home was not safe. Here is the specific application that tends to arrive in this argument with the quality of something that was always obvious but had never been named directly. Think about the most reliable indicator that you are in a relationship where the conditions are wrong, not the dramatic evidence, not the betrayal or the obvious cruelty, but the subtler, more persistent evidence. The moment in which you need something, not an unreasonable thing, not a large thing, but something ordinary that anyone in the relationship would reasonably want, and you perform the internal calculation before asking for it. The calculation that assesses, is this ask likely to be well received? Will it be seen as too much? Will asking for it change how the other person sees me in a direction I cannot afford? Will the cost of asking exceed the benefit of receiving? That calculation is the model, and the fact that you perform it automatically, usually below the threshold of noticing it as a calculation, as a rapid sense that some asks are available and others are not, tells you more about the internal model of what you deserve than any amount of direct self-assessment. You do not perform this calculation in relation to things you believe are yours by right. You perform it in relation to things that the model has classified as conditional. The category of ordinary relational needs that feel, in certain relationships, like impositions, that feel like more than the terms permit, is precisely the category of things the model has decided is not securely available to you. Epictetus distinguished between what is in our control and what is not, and applied this distinction with a rigor that tends to produce discomfort when applied to the present argument. What is not in your control, the other person's capacity and willingness to meet your needs. What is in your control, the internal model that determines which conditions feel like normal and which feel like more than you can expect. The model is not fate, it is not character. It is the accumulated residue of a relational history organized into a set of operating assumptions, and it is the one variable in the pattern that is actually available to be changed. But the change cannot be made by deciding the model is wrong. The model does not respond to intellectual revision. It responds to the accumulated experience of being in relationships whose terms do not match its predictions. And surviving that, and finding that the model was incorrect, and slowly, with repetition, having the predictions revised by the evidence. The problem is that the model is designed to prevent exactly this. It selects for relationships whose terms confirm its predictions, which means the disconfirming evidence is rarely gathered. The loop is self-sealing. Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment has an application here that is distinct from its standard uses, and it is important because it names a dynamic that tends to operate in people with this formation without being recognized as what it is. Ressentiment, in his technical usage, is the psychological state of someone who cannot enact genuine self-transformation, who, unable to move toward what they want and are capable of, converts the incapacity into a moral framework that makes remaining where they are virtuous. The specific version relevant here is not organized around external targets of resentment, but around the internal target of one's own unlived possibility. The person who stays in conditions that undervalue them frequently develops, over time, an elaborate moral framework for the staying. They are loyal, they are patient. They understand that people are complicated and that the imperfection of others does not disqualify them from love. They have a sophisticated account of why leaving would be the easier but less honorable choice. These positions are not dishonest, they have real content, they have genuine ethical weight, and they are held with complete sincerity. They are also serving a function that the sincerity does not fully account for. They are making the incapacity to leave, the structural difficulty of moving toward conditions that the model has not approved as available, into a virtue that the staying can be organized around. The loyalty is real. It is also what the inability to leave looks like when it is run through the moral vocabulary. This is not self-indictment. It is the accurate name for a specific mechanism that produces genuine suffering while appearing to be principled endurance. The endurance is real. What it is enduring is partly what is claimed, the ordinary difficulty of real relationships, and partly something the claim does not address, the impossibility, given the current model, of believing that conditions more consistent with your actual worth are reliably available and that you would not sabotage them if they arrived. Here is where the argument gets complicated in a way that most accounts of this phenomenon do not reach. The standard conclusion that follows from everything said so far is, your model of what you deserve is too low, and the work is to raise it. This is not wrong as a direction, but it is incomplete in a way that produces a specific failure mode. The person understands the model is too low, endorses intellectually the idea that they deserve better, and then continues to operate from the same model in practice, while experiencing a new dimension of shame about doing so. The shame is counterproductive, and not only because shame rarely produces structural change. It is counterproductive because it mislocates the problem. The model was not chosen. It was assembled under conditions of genuine constraint by a self that was doing the best available work with the materials at hand. The self that learned that its worth was conditional learned this from people on whom it was genuinely dependent, people whose conditional regard was not a malicious imposition, but the natural expression of their own formations, their own models, their own limits. The wound was real. It was also, in an important sense, unintentional. And the self that organized itself around that wound was not weak or deficient. It was adaptive. What Fromm was pointing at when he wrote about love as an active orientation, love as the willingness to attend to the actual reality of another person, applies with equal force to the relationship to the self. The movement required is not the decision to have higher self-worth, which is not a decision that can be made and then implemented. It is the practice of attending to the self with the same quality of active interest that genuine love requires when directed outward. The willingness to notice what the self actually needs, as distinct from what the model has decided, is available. The willingness to register the moment when the calculation happens, the rapid assessment of whether the need is an imposition, and to treat that moment as information about the model rather than as accurate perception of the terms. This is slower than it sounds. And it has a specific complication that the recovery literature tends to omit. The people who have operated on the low model for long enough have frequently built their lives around the specific competencies the model developed. The attunement to others' needs, the capacity for endurance, the skill at navigating difficult people. These are genuine capabilities, and they were produced by the model's demands. Processing the model does not automatically replace them with something better. It requires the development of different capabilities alongside the ones already present, and in the transition, there is frequently a period of genuine disorientation in which the old competencies are being examined and the new ones are not yet reliable. William James wrote that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings could alter their outer lives by altering their inner attitudes. This is often cited as encouragement, which it is. It is less often examined as description, as a precise account of the sequence that the change requires, inner first, outer following. Not as a decision, but as a consequence of the inner alteration becoming stable enough to generate different behavior automatically, without the continuous effort of overriding the old pattern through sheer intention. The inner alteration relevant here is not a change in self-esteem, which is a surface phenomenon that fluctuates with circumstances. It is a change in the operating model, in the deep assumptions about what is available, what is reasonable to expect, what constitutes a condition worth leaving rather than one to be adapted to. This change is not produced by insight, though insight is usually necessary. It is produced by the specific experience of being in a situation where the model's predictions are incorrect and staying in it long enough to let the incorrectness register at a level below conscious thought. Which is to say, the change requires exactly the experience that the model is organized to prevent. The model selects for confirming relationships and exits from disconfirming ones. The disconfirming relationship, the one in which you are treated as though your worth is not conditional, in which your needs are received as ordinary rather than as impositions, in which remaining does not require continuous management, feels wrong to the model, which means it feels wrong to you, even when it is better by every available measure. The ability to remain in that discomfort, to not exit the relationship that does not confirm the model, to not sabotage the conditions that the model has not approved, is not produced by understanding that the model is wrong. It is produced by the accumulated experience of staying and finding that the model's predictions failed to materialize, that the regard remained when it was supposed to withdraw, that the need, when expressed, was met without the cost the model predicted, that the ground did not give way. This takes longer than any argument about it can, and it requires, in the period before the model has been sufficiently revised, a quality of deliberate attention to the difference between the model's felt sense of the situation and the actual evidence of the situation, because they will not always agree, and the felt sense will always feel more real, and choosing the evidence over the feeling will feel for a considerable time like an act of faith rather than a reasonable response to available information. Dostoevsky's underground man, at the moment in the narrative when he has his clearest opportunity for something different, when someone offers him genuine regard, without conditions, without the management operations he is accustomed to, does what the model requires. He destroys it, not through dramatic cruelty, but through the specific small withdrawals and manipulations and tests that the model generates when it encounters conditions it has not approved. He makes the relationship confirm the model, and then he suffers in the wreckage, with the eloquence of someone who has understood everything and changed nothing. He is not a villain in this moment. He is the clearest depiction available of what the model does when the conditions that would allow it to be revised actually arrive. The revision is the most threatening thing the model can encounter, more threatening than the confirming difficult relationship, because the difficult relationship is navigable on the model's terms. The good relationship is not. And what cannot be navigated on the model's terms is, to the model, a problem. You have probably done some version of this. Not at Dostoevsky's intensity. The underground man is a literary extreme, not a clinical template. But you have probably, in a relationship that was better than what you were used to, found the problem that confirmed the model, waited for the withdrawal that the model predicted, arranged through small choices that felt at the time like reasoned responses to genuine concerns, the conditions that proved the model was right. This is not a reason for despair. It is the accurate description of what the model does at the threshold of its own revision. And the fact that you did it does not mean the model cannot change. It means you have encountered the specific place where the change is hardest, which is also the place where it matters most. The question that this entire argument is building toward, the one that cannot be answered by the argument itself, but that the argument makes possible to ask clearly, is this: if you fully believed in the functional operating sense rather than the intellectual endorsement sense, that your needs are not an imposition, that your presence is not a cost that must be offset by continuous usefulness, that the conditions you have been accepting are not the conditions you are limited to, what would you do differently? Not in the abstract, specifically. The relationship you would leave or transform or enter differently. The ask you would make without the prior calculation. The need you would express without the preemptive apology. You probably already know the answer to at least part of this. The part you know is the evidence that the model has not convinced you entirely, that there is something in you that has always known the terms were not right, that has registered the discomfort even when it did not produce action, that has maintained in some corner of available awareness the sense that things should be different even without a clear account of how to make them so. That part is not the model. It is the part the model has been managing. The work is not to remove the model, which is not removable by decision. It is to create enough space between the model's operation and your response to it that the part that knows better can sometimes influence what happens next. Not always, not cleanly, but more than it currently does. The conditions you are in are not random. They correspond to a model, and the model, however established, is not the truth about what is available to you. It is the truth about what was available at a specific moment, in a specific context, to a specific version of you that no longer needs to be the final version. The final version is not fixed yet. That is either frightening or the most important thing in this argument, depending on what you decide to do with it.